We're going to do a little scene in Rouen, which is kind of down the Seine River near the Atlantic coast. We've sailed from Paris to Normandy earlier this fall. I took a group of painters and we stopped in Rouen, and there's this massive cathedral there in the center square of the city. And then all of the little lanes are like a warren of pathways and alleys and cobblestone streets that meander away from the center square like spokes of a wheel. And they're all very tall buildings, and so you just get glimpses of the cathedral as you look down these lanes. And the photo that I took, this was a picture I took of my group as we were going on a tour down the street. I don't know if everybody can see this yet. Anyway, what I've got is one of the many snapshots that I took of our group, and you can barely see through the mist the cathedral at the end of the lane. And when we think about how we would handle this in a sketch or a painting, we want to create kind of a shadow side and a warmer side of the building. And on the right side, we have buildings and marble and limestone that's a little bit warmer. And then everything over on the left side, we want to make even darker than the photo reference shows, so that we can get more contrast between our temperatures in values on our paper. The painting that I have here in front of you is the sample painting that I did when I prepared for this. But my line drawing that I prepared has a lot of vertical facades coming down the left side and the right side with a shape, kind of an irregular shape that goes right through the little off center, which is where all the light will be. And if you look at our photo reference, I'll bring this up, there's a lot of light reflected in the cobblestones down here. So this gives us sort of a pathway of light that leads us to the group of people in the middle ground and the cathedral beyond. And then we want to really create some nice darks over on the left to highlight one of the viewers there that are taking some pictures with the umbrellas. And then the cobblestones being wet will be having a reflective surface. So that's the game plan. What we want to start off with, I'm going to start with a big mop brush. And rather than wetting my whole paper, all I'm going to do is lightly spritz it with some mist where the sky would be. Some of it will go over the area where the building facades are, and that's okay. The other question somebody might have had, I want to offset that. I'm working on a rough block of Bohong paper. This is a Chinese paper. I think it's available through Australia, but it has a fairly unique rough surface to it, which I find kind of intriguing. It also is really helps with the dry brushing effect. But to start off, I'm going to get my brush wet, get a little bit of cobalt blue mixed up, and you can see if the camera on my my palette, I'm getting just kind of a nice wet wash of cool cobalt blue, but it's pretty light value. There's not mostly water, just a little bit of tint. We'll start with that. Then I also want to, I'm just going to use a different brush so I can mix something up in advance. I'm going to get a little bit of yellow ochre mixed over here on the side and just make sure it's also pretty wet, but I don't want to mix them together because then it'll neutralize. So I've got two things mixed up here, and I'm going to start coming down this side of the sky and make sure my brush is wet enough, and I'll just come right through the cathedral, right through the rooftops, come on down, and then rinse my brush and pick up some of that yellow ochre that I mixed up ahead of time, and we'll come down over on this side next to the buildings. And then I'm just going to take my brush and kind of wipe it back and forth across the painting as it goes down towards the eye level at the end of the lane. So now we've just created just a little bit of tint. It's a little bit of coolness over on the left side, a little bit of warmth over on the right side. I'm going to take it beyond where the steeple would be. But you notice I just went right over the cathedral because I don't really want to try to differentiate. I want to make sure that the sky feels like it's flowing right behind the cathedral. We'll let that dry. And if you want to go ahead and do that, This is kind of the key underlayment that we want to lay down as our first step. So go ahead and get your palette going, get your brushes going, and start mixing up your sky. And I'm just going to take some of this warm color right on down the facade as a first coat. I'm not trying to be perfect with it. I'm just kind of laying it in to get a little bit of warmth over here. But I want to keep this fairly dry because when I come back to do that right side of the building, we want it completely dry. I'm going to add just a little bit more cool blue up high in this damp part of the paper. But you notice I left this area right in here above the rooftops, nice and warm. It's got just a little bit of warmth to it. Let's see if I can zero in on that a little bit. Does that help you see how this is a little warmer than where the cool cobalt is in the wash over on the left side of the sky? When I come in with a darker pigment of warm yellow ochre, it'll pull these buildings forward, and the lighter values of the sky will push everything back. So we'll let my brush, rinse my brush off. I'm going to let this dry, and I'll let you get that finished up. Have fun with the sky. And I'm just using a heat gun here, so it's quieter. And sometimes if you have a little bit of dribble, you can just take a tissue and just kind of dab at it lightly to get it to dry quicker. Some of you are in a much more humid location than where I am, so this should dry fairly quickly. But I'm on 300 pound, which is the heavier weight paper. It's in a block so that it's adhered to this block. I don't have to tape it down. If you have 140 pound paper, I would suggest just clipping it at the two upper corners, so that as it gets wet, it can expand naturally without having to buckle. So I'll back this up a little bit so you can see everything. And what I want to start now is working my darker cools. I've got to make sure this is fairly dry though before I start my building in front of that cathedral. I want my cathedral to feel a little bit warmer than some of these buildings in shadow. So the buildings in shadow on the left side have got to be cooler and darker. And we'll start with this one building that I've drawn over here. And I'm going to use a flat. I'll get a nice neutralized cobalt, add a little bit of burnt orange to it, maybe a little bit of yellow ochre as well. Just that's going to get a little too dark. So I'll start over right here. There we go. That's about the value that I'm looking for. I want to bring this right across using the edge of my brush to capture the sweep of that roof, and then rinse my brush and add a little bit warmer raw umber and just start allowing that warmth with the umber to kind of glow. And I'm always looking for a bit of a glow in every wash that I do so that it transitions from a cool to a warm and then back to cools, and we start picking up different colors. I'm also going to paint around this lamp fixture that's projecting out from the wall. I'll add a little bit of orange in here as well. And then go back to a cooler color, maybe an ultramarine, which is definitely going to be cooler. And we'll just keep coming down. And then as I work in and around these shapes of these umbrellas, I just create a nice wash. Now, I've got this far roof top that's fairly dark. So I'm going to use a little bit of burnt orange, ultramarine. Those two colors make a really lively dark. I want to keep it a little bit on the cooler side, so I add just a little bit more blue to that mix. And now I'm going to angle my brush right along the edge of that rooftop and let it come down. I don't want to get it too dark, but we'll bring that and show these additional little roof projections that are coming out. And it just kind of works its way down around the umbrellas, around these people's heads that are down there. And I'm going to just lightly pick up a little bit of that excess pigment. I don't care if it's flows out into where the cathedral is. That's okay. We can always clean that up. But I'm going to come back and make sure that this blends right into the next level. I don't want to have a hard line there. I want to soften that and come in behind some of these awnings that are in the foreground. So we'll come back and come in right underneath these little canopies up in the rooftops with a nice dark. I want to change that up and go to a warm with a little bit of burnt orange. Get that in there. Clean our brush and just pull that right on down. So it just rolls right down the facade. Already we're getting a cooler look to it. I'm going to add a little bit of blue in there and just let it roll through that vertical thing. I've got my board elevated probably about 4 or 5 inches so that it has a good slope to it and it keeps coming down. I want to get a little bit more of the raw umber, a warmer color on this facade underneath the awning. And I want to be careful that I work around and create a negative shape for the person in the foreground's hat and umbrella and arms. So we'll just let that kind of work right in there. I'm going to add just a touch of cool underneath this awning. And then there's an area in the buildings there that has a bit more coolness to it. So I'm going to get right underneath these awnings with some cooler color, using a little bit of cerulean, a little cobalt, and then pick up a little bit of that raw umber. And it's just a big mixture of color that kind of comes down through that shape. And I'm just using water on my brush to kind of accelerate the flow of that wash downward towards the base. And right underneath the umbrellas, or awnings rather, I should say, I want to get a little bit darker. I want to add in some cooler mix. I'll add in just a touch of burnt orange in a couple spots just to bring it closer to us. You see how if you drag a flat over this rough surface of paper, you'll get a little bit of skipping, and it gives it that texture that's so interesting. And as we get down towards the base, I'm just going to leave this kind of a neutral. We'll come back in and add some darks around as some of these doors and entries and so forth. But now I'm going to go back up and capture up towards the rooftops. And this is all one big wash that we're working with here. We have to work fairly quickly because we want all the water to kind of move at the same rate across the surface of the paper. I'm using the flat to capture these little roof gidgies that come out. It's very dark up here because it's in silhouette against a very light sky. Then I rinse my brush and I just start pulling it down. And I want to also add a little bit of cooler color where some of these windows are in here. They're just sort of a little bit of a cerulean blue. And I'm not trying to actually paint any of the windows. I'm just adding a little bit of temperature change to those windows just to give it a little bit of variety. I'll add some cobalt in it. Cobalt is a little cooler than the cerulean. And I'm going to leave a little bit of white in here to suggest the directionality of the perspective. So I'll just kind of move that along here and leave little chops of white negative shape. And I'll just rinse my brush and pull this right across some of these little cupola shapes in the building adjacent to it. And now just using a wet brush, I'm going to work around this lamp fixture, this sconce, and bring it down to the top of the awning. And we'll just keep working our way down and then add raw umber, which is sort of a cool, neutral beige. Paint right through the metalwork that's projecting out from the building that's supporting the lamps. add a little bit of cool, bring it right down to kind of approximately where the top of this facade is that's supporting the awning. And it's all very wet. It's got a lot of different movement in it. It's got a lot of action and activity. I can always come back as this paper starts to dry a little bit and take some drier paint. I'm using a little bit of burnt umber, or I'm sorry, burnt orange and ultramarine, and coming in right underneath a couple of these marks that are negative shapes that indicate little bits of the building. And we'll just throw those on there and let them kind of bleed downward, just kind of like the water as it runs down the facade, it leaves these streaks. There we go. Now we have at this point, I've got to finish some of these little dog houses or whatever you want to call them that are sticking out from the rooftops, and they're going to be.
Excuse me, Randy.
Yes.
Could you please pull your painting down just a tad? We can't see the top part on my screen. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And we're just going to come back in here and add a little bit of dark with sort of a dry brush. I don't want it to be too wet, but we're capturing some of these little gidgies that are coming off the edge there that give it definition. And then as I get down into that little cupola thing, we're going to use a cool color. Come across here. And then I'll add some darks to that after that dries. As we look at where these arches are, if you go back to your photo, here's a picture of the photo. All of these arches that are in the building, they're not really important to be completely detailed. We just want to have a vague suggestion or indication of that. So the way we do that is we just take maybe a round. I've got a nice synthetic round here. If you look at the camera, it's dry. And I'm going to just get it a little bit damp and pick up some dark, drier pigment. And I don't know if you can see this on my palette, but I just drag my finger through it. It's pretty dry. I'll get a little bit warmer. There we go. Add a little bit of blue to that. And now the paper is still pretty wet. So I'm just going to kind of come in here and suggest where some of these arches are without being too literal. I just want to give some dark shadowing in there that suggests that there's some shapes. And we can come in underneath each one of these with a little slash where the sills are, and it just sort of suggests where it all works. And then going up above, we've got a piece of facade that runs kind of horizontally across the face of that building. And I'm just going to take some of this drier paint, drop it in underneath there just to suggest the directionality of the perspective. And we're working while the paper's still damp to get this soft, wet and wet look. And anytime you have a wet surface that has a wash on it, if you want something to sit on that surface as a darker mark and not bloom, the paint you apply to that damp surface has to be drier than the moisture on the surface. So I'm going to come back with some, and mix in my palette, some really nice, dry, dark, cool color. And I have these doorways in here, and I'm just going to kind of drop in some darks in here. And they don't have to be perfect, but they're just suggesting where these openings are. I can come back in with a little bit of moisture on my brush, and I can soften some of these edges and bring them right down to the ground. Use a flat that's just clean, no paint on it, just slightly damp. And I can soften these edges and just drag it down. And it creates these really nice little cool openings that are just a suggestion that there's something there without being too literal. And then as we get down into the bottom, I can add more color later. I can come back in and add a little bit of teal. Maybe we put something like that in there. We just throw in a few things and let it, maybe a little bit of orange. just whatever color, that gives you some contrast between cools and warms, maybe a little bit of alizarin. And what that color in there does, it just sort of suggests that there's maybe a shop, there's some windows, there's some things that we can't really see because they're not in the center of interest. They're not the most critical, important thing for us to be looking at. But it breaks it up. It gives us some variety within these openings that makes them a little more interesting. And I'm going to take my squirt gun here, my misting bottle, and give it just a quick little squirt, and it just softens all of those shapes, takes them out of focus. Above the awning, there's a little bit of facade left. So I'm going to come in with some of that same really dark mix that I had just mixed up. I'm going to make sure I've got it well mixed into my brush and is dark enough that it's going to create a nice contrast with my awning when I go to put my awning color in there. I'm just going to kind of come across here, capture the sweep of that awning, clean my brush, take my round, and just soften the rest of this right into the next building. And I might add a little bit of cool to that as well, particularly under here. We get underneath that, and then we want to put another little bit of cool across here. Come in right underneath an additional little architectural feature that just suggests where the perspective lines are going. And I can come back with the same mix that I've just been working with and create some additional doorways. They're not all that important. They just give a context to the fact that there's a whole series of shops down this road. All right, I'm going to stop here and let you play with this because there's quite a bit here that we've done. I've tried to go back and forth between warms and cools. Cools would be anything mixed with like a raw umber or a burnt orange and mixed with a little bit of cobalt. I did have a little bit of cerulean up in there. If you notice, we've got some windows. This is now, it's still pretty wet. I'm going to hold off on putting any indications of windows into that blue area. But if you looked at our photo reference, part of the building, all the trim on those windows was blue. So I just put a wash of blue across that upper part of the building. And it also helped darken that a little. We also want to have this appear as a dark silhouette against that light value sky to make it come forward. So one of the things that we can do once this dries is come back underneath these little overhangs and give them a lot more darker value. We'll enrich that somewhat. This rooftop here, I want to come back in and darken that as well. When you look at your photo reference, we have a whole series of little ornaments and gidgies and projections that come out from that roof, and they're all very dark against the light sky. So that's why we want to create that value contrast to bring this whole little avenue towards the viewer. So go ahead and finish that up. And if you get a little bit of the some of these darks creeping into your awning, that's okay. It's going to be perfect. So, because we don't want anything to be absolutely, tight. We want to keep it loose and rainy and misty and atmospheric. I'm taking all the color out of this flat brush. I squeezed all the water out of it, so it's just damp. And I can come down now and come across some of the facades here and create a little bit of some openings and some lighter areas that come across there. We'll let that dry. The one thing I do want to do while this is wet is really create a strong shape for my umbrella. So I'm just going to take the color that's already on the building facades and just soften it as I work it around the edge of that umbrella, just so that it gives a nice crisp shape to the shape of that umbrella. That way, later when this dries, it'll all be very apparent. All right, I think I'll start working on drying some of this, particularly up around the rooftops, which is where I want to darken. And I need to have this dry before I do that. So while you're painting, I'm drying. And it'll be up around the upper area on the upper left rooftops against that cooler sky that's there. So what I do is I just mix up again some burnt orange, a little ultramarine. It's not black, but it's very, very dark, and it's a lively dark. And I can come back in now and get a little bit of a dry brush effect in some of these little shapes that are coming across and create just a more interesting textural effect. I'm just going to add a little bit of warmth inside these little areas, get a little cooler color with some cobalt, and we'll come back in along the tops of these little roofs, clean my brush, and then just soften that down towards the bottom edge of the angled rooftop. So it creates the darkest value up at the top of the pitch of that roof, and it gets lighter as it moves down. It's easy to overwork this, so just leave it alone. Don't try to do too much. We've got this building that's in the background here. It's got some trim on it. I'm going to make it a little darker right along the edge here, clean my brush, and soften the back edge of that so that it just feels a little darker, closer to the viewer, and gets lighter as it moves away from the viewer towards the cathedral. Once all this is dry, we're going to move to a different area in this painting. We're going to move to the cathedral itself. And but I'm going to let you kind of finish this up. One of the things I do want to do while the paper is still slightly damp is come in with some raw umber and just create some of the slashes for these windows that are in some of these buildings that are looking down the road. And at the very top of the windows, they get a little darker. So I'm just dropping in a little darker value in that wet brush stroke I just added, just so that it kind of gives the impression of shadow within those little arches. And that's about all I need to do, I think, with that. We'll put a few of these little, like the window sills now. The paper is starting to dry, so I can get a little darker trim on there, following the perspective lines. And we'll let that go for a second. Let's see. I think we can actually put in a few of the darks where the windows are in that blue area where the blue window trim is. I'm just going to come back in here and put a few of these little marks across here. Don't need a whole lot, and we don't want to be too literal. You just want to have something that kind of comes down the length of these windows to suggest that there's shadows within each of the openings that creates where the windows are. That works. And then we can go maybe with a warmer color up above that for some additional windows. We'll just have these up there. And I'm going to dry. Take my heat gun, we'll accelerate the drying process. And I think while we're still playing with the this side of the lane, I'm going to get a wide brush, get it wet, and get a little bit of turquoise onto my brush. I want to add a little bit of green to that. So I'll add some sap green. And I've got a nice green color for the awnings. And I'm just going to kind of give us a little sweep up like this. And then I'll use a small brush, my round, and just wet the top part of that. So it takes that dark green and it brings it up towards the top of the awning. but it leaves the darkest value down towards the bottom of the awning. And as more light gets on it, it gets lighter and lighter as it moves away. And we can take just a little slash of dark in between them there. And I might even take some of the same color and put it underneath the awning, just to suggest that maybe there's some of that green glow in the dark part of the shadow above the awning. But I take a brush that's just damp around, and I just soften that dark. And that works. All right, I'm gonna clean my palette. I don't want any more of this green to contaminate my warm colors for the other side of the buildings or the cathedral. So I'm gonna just take some tissue, a little bit of water, and get all that out of my palette. It served its purpose already. All right. One of the things I'm seeing is the initial sky that I laid down. It really went pretty light. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to use some clean water from my other bucket, and I'm going to just touch up my sky a little bit and drop in some cooler color as it comes down. And I'm not taking it all the way over. I'm just allowing it to soften. And I want to have that cooler background behind the cathedral, because the cathedral is going to have more of a raw umber, raw sienna type look to it. But I had to get a little cooler background in there. Pull this right up. There we go. All right, now the roadway. I think we always want to be thinking about 3 moves ahead. The roadway has to be a little warmer. I talked about keeping some light in the reflections that comes down, so we have a pathway of light that takes us back to the cathedral. But I also want this to be a fairly soft edge across here, so I don't want to get this too defined. What I'm going to do is just take my flat and make sure I tickle that a little bit, and I pull some of that down into the roadway so that it doesn't have too hard of an edge as it dries. We'll just leave that alone for the time being. Kind of move around, work around the person in the foreground. So now I'm testing my paper, and over here on this side, the right side of the little lane, that building facade is totally dry. So I'm going to take and clean my palette from some of this, all this, at least give myself a spot where I can mix up a nice, fresh, clean color of light yellow ochre. And I want to use a fairly good sized flat brush for this, because I'm just going to be coming straight down. And we'll start with this yellow ochre with a little bit of raw umber. And we'll get right up underneath these little awning things that are little canopies sticking out from the buildings. And I'm just going to drag it down like that. And if some of it bleeds up into the sky, that's okay, because by the time we get this all nice and dark, or darker than the cathedral, some of that's going to play right into the sky, so that's fine. And I'm just going to come down around my people, leave them a white negative shape for the moment, and bring this right down along the base of the facade of these buildings. Take a bigger brush, and I'm going to get a darker raw umber. Mixing this up, you can see how much darker this is. And I'll add just a little bit of the raw sienna to that. And just bring that straight on down. And then I want to get a little bit of coolness to that. So I'm going to add just a touch of cobalt to this. So we get a little bit of a grayish cast to this. And when you mix the raw umber with the cobalt, you're going to get a beautiful little kind of warm color, kind of a stone marble color. And then I'm just gonna allow some of this scratchy dry brush to go right across the roadway. But you notice that the right side of the building is noticeably warmer than the left side, which is noticeably cooler. And we want that contrast to play across there. While this is wet, I want to take the smaller flat that is a little stiffer, and I'm going to create these little lines of perspective that are made up from the canopies as we look down the lane. And I'll go back to my darker mix, a little bit of burnt orange, and a little bit of ultramarine blue. And you get those mixed up, maybe add just a touch of raw umber. And then I want to come right in here and just create these little projections that come across, and then just take a clean brush and start pulling them down along the edge. And that edge is the end of the alley or the end of the lane, that last building. And that's what we're trying to define. So I'll get a little bit of this, and this will, I'm just putting a couple of little tick marks on here, very quick, to define where those windows are. And as we get lower, we'll get a little cooler in here. We'll just create the base to this building. And this is still pretty wet up above, so I'm going to hold off on doing that for a bit. So go ahead and just take it this far, and we'll come back after it's dry and we'll add more layers to this. But right now, that's pretty good where we want to be. So always, once you've got your basic wash down, dry it. Because if you try to keep going back in while your paper is damp with more color, more detail, it's going to get muddy. You're going to neutralize everything you put on the surface of the paper if you try to paint back into a damp wash. So you want to make sure your wash is completely dry before you go on to the next step. And that's why I'm using, if you're muted, you can use your hairdryer, but I'm using a heat gun, which is pretty quiet, allows me to keep talking, allows you to hear what I'm saying. So I still have a pretty high sheen or reflection on the paper. It tells me this is still very wet. I just want to get it completely dry. And we want to make sure that this, the canopies up around the roof lines here and these little cornices are what's going to really make this thing pop. So we have to be totally dry before we can go on to that step. Takes a little bit of time to do that. The next thing I'm going to do before I finish this right side of the building is we'll go back in and we'll work with our cathedral. We want to start and probably use a fairly small brush. I'm going to use a little mop brush because it holds plenty of water, but it also has a pretty nice defined point that allows me to get into some of the finer edge work for the cathedral. I'm going to use a combination of the raw umber and the yellow ochre or raw sienna, whatever you have available, and just a touch of the cobalt, just to give it a little bit darker value up at the top. And if you notice, before I do that, look at your photo reference. You see how the spire on this cathedral is darker against that light sky. And as it comes down towards the ground level, the cathedral takes on a lighter value. This is sort of an optical illusion, but when you have something that's sticking up in the air and you've got a very light sky behind it, it's going to look darker. As it gets down behind some of these other darker features, it's going to become lighter. So we'll start with a very light raw umber mixture. My paper's still a little damp. That's okay. It's going to give me kind of a fuzzy edge to this cathedral. And I've got some of these little secondary spires showing up. And I'm just very quickly filling in the shape of this cathedral. And now as I get lower, I want it to get a little warmer and lighter. That means probably less pigment and nothing quite as dark as what was up there in the upper part. Now over on the edge here where I have a really light sky, I do want this to be a little darker. So I'm just adding a little bit of the dark mixture from the junk in my palette just to make sure that it shows up against that light sky on this one side. As I work my way down, I've got a little bit lighter spire here. This is a secondary spire. And I'm not going to try to paint any details in here. I just want to take my wet brush, and that's why I'm using this small mop, and just wetting and dragging this wash right on down to the street level. And we'll just get a little bit of warmth coming down through the middle of this, coming around some of the opening of this big, I don't know, Lois, what do you call these entries to these cathedrals? There's got to be a name for them. I'm sure Bill could tell us. But it's a big arched.
I've got absolutely no idea. Archway.
Yeah, big archway. But now you can see.
Maybe a portico?
Portico, very good.
That would do.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a beautiful kind of goes in and out of some cools and warms. Got a little bit of a fuzzy edge there because it's raining. We can't see all the definition of this thing. It's just sort of a shape. Obviously, we have to make the right side of our paper a little bit darker to make that recede into the background as our cathedral. But we also have to let it completely dry before we try to finish putting any more details in here. I want to make sure that we get everything down around the shoulders and heads of the people down the street. I'm going to let that dry now. And then we'll go back in and add some shadows and just a few little vague features. It's pretty wet. You can always add a suggestion of some openings and some windows and some things within this cathedral, but if the paper is soaking wet, you will never get a really good crisp, mark on there. So I want to let this dry just a little bit so it settles down. I call that settling down. It's letting the water settle into the tooth of the paper so that it isn't all sitting up on the surface. Because if the water is still sitting up on the surface, if I touch this with another pigment, the pigment will run everywhere. But it's about where I want it now. And I'll just take a little darker value of what I have already mixed up in my palette that I mixed for the cathedral. And I'm just going to lay down the edge of my brush. And I see that's still pretty wet. It left a very soft mark that's sort of reminiscent of, all the different details that are happening on the side of this cathedral. I don't really want to do much more than that. I'm going to dry some more so they can go in and define the shadows inside that portico. And whoever said that, that's a great word, portico. I appreciate that.
That was Louise.
There you go. Now I still see the pencil lines through here, so I want to probably come back and add just a little bit more value right up against some of these pencil lines so that we don't necessarily see all that detail. We're just going to get just a little bit darker value in a couple spots here. Take our damp, clean brush and just drag that dark out into the cathedral. I'm going to add just a touch of the blue to that. There we go. Now it's kind of runny and soft, and we've got go back and forth between some cools and warms, but the overall shape is a warm shape. And I'm testing where this portico arch is to make sure it's getting dry. because I want to take a little bit, I'm going to work with my medium-sized round, because I can control that pretty well, and mix up kind of a little bit of raw umber. It's got kind of a little more warmth to it, but it's also dark. And I'm going to drop that in right inside that opening to create a value contrast. And I'll just take a little bit of water, drag it down, and define that opening. And let it get light as it goes to the very bottom, because bounce light is reflecting in to the bottom of this. It's mainly up at the top where we're seeing the value contrast. And I want to just, while it's wet, I'll just drop in a little bit of the darker pigment from my palette in my mixing well. And then it sort of tends to kind of lean over to the right side a little bit in value. So I want to get a little bit more value coming down this side than I do on the other side. Clean my brush, kind of drag this all, soften it, let all this run through that shape. The rest of my cathedral is still very, very wet, so I want to give it a chance to dry a little bit and use maybe just some of the raw umber, not the raw umber, the raw sienna rather, and see if we can't get a couple of these little shapes in here that are just suggestive of structure there in the building. Come in behind the little frieze that's around the edges of that opening, that portico, and we'll just let that go up, get a little cool coming down one side of it. If you get too much, just take a tissue and kind of dab it real quick, and you're back to a vague shape. All right. I'm going to add just a little bit of orange over here on this side in that shadow area, and then blend that with the darker values that we just put in there. And then add a little bit of, just a couple of quick strokes around that frieze that's on around the opening. All right. Time to let this kind of settle down and dry. So while you're painting, I'm just going to be working on just softening a few of these things, making sure that I don't have real wet surface. And then we'll go back to the facades on the right side of the lane. As I go down, I'm going to take some of this color that we just put on this and drag it across some of these features on the cathedral. There we go. But it has to be dry before we can attack the vertical facades on the right. I'm just going to let this dry. All right, we can kind of assess what we've done so far. We went in and put a very kind of wet wash with predominantly cool colors on the shadow side over on the left. We preserved a few negative shapes and a few dark shapes where the sills and the horizontal architectural features are that create a fairly extreme perspective that takes us back. All of these things are pointing us back towards the cathedral at the end of the lane. but they also reinforce the fact that we're looking at a 1-point perspective. We kept the openings for the doors, the windows of the shops, all very soft and wet. We don't want to have a lot of real strong, hard edges. We just wanted to give the impression that there's some vague shadows. It's kind of rainy and misty, and there's not a lot of definition that we can see clearly at this point. We're going to see all these people, the crowd of people at the end of the lane. There'll be a lot of them will be in silhouettes, but they'll have little sparkles of light on their hats and heads, and reflections on their shoulders. But there'll be reflections on the lane and coming in between them where we see their legs. So all of these things reinforce the light of reflections that come up and take us down the lane to the cathedral at the back end of the square. Before we can finish that, though, we have to go back to our facade on the right side and really punch up those little canopies and windowsills and things that project out into the walkway that give it structure. So what I'm going to do is take probably a round. You can use a small round mop or a medium-sized round, and mix up some nice warm darks. We want to use a burnt orange and a little bit of ultramarine to get a nice drier mix. Get a little darker blue, like a royal blue, mixed with some of that burnt orange. And then I'm going to really kind of pop this in here quickly as all the details that are pushing out away from these buildings. We've got some little structural things that are coming off the building. We've got this cornice way thing, and I'm just doing a real quick stroke, almost a dry brush as I cut back. And then I've got a little cooler, a little bit more of the cobalt or ultramarine mixed to this, to some of these that are closer to us. These little canopies that come off the window tops. They're to keep the rain out of the windows, because I think, Lois, they don't have window screens there, so they have canopies. And I think that keeps some of the rain out. I'm guessing.
Yes, they would have had shutters, but it was really to keep the sun out rather than the rain, I suspect.
But they're marvelous things for painting. I just love all the little beautiful details that you get in this European architecture. But now you can see how dark that is against that light warm limestone. It just really kind of accentuates the building shapes. I'm going to take just a very watered down glaze, like a cobalt, and just put a light color on this little sloped cupola. And we'll just kind of let it run right into the dark that's in the underside of this eave. And then we've got all these little windows that come down off of these. But rather than try to get too crisp an edge, I'm just taking a damp brush and I'm softening all of these the bottom edge of these little canopies so that they're just kind of vague. And then as we get back up into the recess here behind this facade, I'm just taking a damp brush and kind of getting a little bit of a slighter, darker, cooler value cutting in behind this facade. And just take a brush and just drag it up the side. And that kind of finishes off that. I'm going to get a little bit warmer here with this. So get down closer to the ground. We start getting a little bit cooler, a little bit darker, a little less warm, because it's in the shadows down here at the base. So we want to start moving more towards a neutral, kind of cooler facade. And now I need to get, I'm working in a big enough shape, I can take a bigger brush and just kind of soften this, bring it down with a raw umber. And then using a big brush, I want to get sort of Oh, that's got green on it. I don't like that. Let's get a different brush. I'll use this one. And I want to add a little bit of cobalt, a little bit of raw umber. And just really quickly drag it down so we get this nice kind of dry brush effect. Can even take my squirt gun and soften some of this as it gets down towards the bottom where it gets cooler. And that just kind of pulls that whole building towards us. And we can always come back in and put a few little details in here that just suggest that there's a little change in the things are tucking in behind columns. Doesn't have to be real obvious. Take a stiffer brush, get a little bit more darker value and drop that in there with those windows start. There we go. This all stays pretty warm up here, but as it gets closer to us, we start building up these warm temperatures. I'm gonna get a little bit of orange in there just to warm it up. See if we can't get this flowing a little bit. I'm gonna tip it up so that it starts running downhill. You get that really nice soft movement. There we go. All right, now we'll let that dry. I want to definitely get this a little darker over here along the edge. Clean my brush, wipe all the water off of it, and then drag that back towards the viewer a little bit. All right, as we get down into the street, we're going to get darker, but I have to let this dry first. So hopefully you can all see. Let me move my camera back a little bit so you can see the whole as it's coming together. Now, can you see how the cooler values on this side, the warmer values on the right side bracket that light value, kind of very obscure cathedral shape in the background? We definitely want to have maybe a little bit of suggestion of something in that inside that opening there. So I'll just throw in a little shape of some warmth, maybe a little bit of around some of the heads. Maybe there. Going back now, this is all dry. I can take that same brush and just take some darker, cooler pigment as I mix up on my palette and just put a couple of little windows in here. There. Sometimes I just take a tissue and blot the bottom edge of these windows a little bit, and it just helps kind of soften everything. And also come back in now with a dark. Just going to take like a really dark blue and burnt orange and throw some shapes in here that are reminiscent of the direction of the perspective. I'm sorry, my brain stopped working. So now while we're waiting for everything else to dry over on the right side, we can take a look at our 3 lamps. We've got 3 of these little lanterns that are projecting out from the buildings. I want to to take a really kind of a neutral, very light value. I don't know if you can see this. I'm just mixing up some of the neutral in my palette here. It's a little bit of cool cobalt mixed with some of that warm raw sienna. And as we look at the underside of the frame of this lamp, I'm just going to drag some of that down into that, just in this one. You won't see it in the others that much. But then I'll take maybe a little bit of Payne's gray, some royal blue, some burnt orange, and get a really nice black. And using the tip of my brush, I can come out and just put a little bit of a couple of details on here. Don't need much more than that. And we'll do a little bit over here. Just sort of capture the top canopy and the bottom. I'm going to go back in later with a smaller brush to do the rest of those and the farther one down. But it just gives us just enough indication that there's some stuff happening. I'm going to soften some of that with just a little bit of water. And now I think what we should do is kind of build up the base along the left side of these buildings. We've got cornices, we've got baseboards, we've got all kinds of things that suggest where the facade comes down. So we're just going to kind of put in a few little marks down in here, very light. You know, when I say light, I'm talking about just a quick stroke, nothing really defined, very, very vague. We might have a couple of things that are suggesting, you know, a header in there, just to make it a little darker, like it's disappearing back into the recesses there. Get a little dark there. I want to get behind here a little bit darker. Because my paper is so dry, I can just kind of drag this across some of these darks and make it a little darker without turning it into mud. It just stays nice and crisp and dark without too much degradation. Now I want to get a little bit of teal and maybe a little sap green. And we'll come in underneath part of this umbrella with a dark mark, clean our brush, and then push a damp brush towards that dark deposit of paint. And you want to come in and define the viewer's arm and shoulder with this mid-tone of teal. And I can come back in with a little darker, maybe a little ultramarine added to that with some of the sap green, and get right up at the top a little darker. And then just let it, because that's already damp, we'll just let it kind of filter back down towards the bottom, but it'll stay darker right up at the top. So it feels like there's a lot of depth back up underneath that umbrella. Once, and I'm going to kind of take this out from underneath my tape that elevated the board so that it lays flat. I want to make sure that all that dark stays right at the upper edge of the inside of that umbrella. And then we can take some of that cool blue that I had. I'm going to put a sign back in here that just sort of is just a couple of quick strokes on the facade of that building. Maybe there's some down. And then also I want to take some orange, and come in and create I know my head's in the way, create a little bit of a dry brush effect or some signage that's projecting out into the lane. And we'll have just a few little marks there just to suggest detail. Maybe there's something over here. And then we can always come back and put a little darker underneath some of these cornices if necessary. I'm going to just take a cool wash and come down across the side of this so that it doesn't look like it's in sun, and come in underneath it with a little bit of cool, so that that thing sticking out really kind of has a little pop of light value there. We'll use some of this dark and come back in now that the little rooftop is dry, and put a little shadow underneath that cupola. Come back in underneath this guy, put some darks in there. A little darker there. Wet it. And let it just come down. And then we'll start putting just some shapes here that are very soft, because this paper is still wet here. And I want to make sure you can see this, so you can kind of see where we're going with this. Little cornices. Here we go. All right, now I want to think a little bit about how we're going to handle the street. We'll let this side dry. I see that if you got some things that need cleaning up, go ahead and take your brush and kind of clean up or soften any edges that need to be softened, so that they don't become a distraction. But my street needs to be fairly wet, so I'm going to take a brush and I'm going to tip this back up so it's got a little elevation. We'll pull it down so you can see it. There we go. And I'm going to work around my person here in the foreground. We'll call her Peggy, because that's who it was. And I'm just going to wet the surface of this, and then come in with a little bit of a cool, mix up a little bit of cobalt, pick up a little bit of raw umber. I'm going to come back in here around her, and that should all run downhill. And then as it starts moving downhill, I want to warm it up with a little bit of burnt orange. And I'm bringing my strokes vertically, and I'll introduce a little bit of cool color in here. And I'll take a stiffer 1-inch flat, and we'll start putting in a little bit of maybe some raw umber. And she's got a little bit of a shadow being cast underneath her feet there. So I'm going to put that in there. We'll come in with a little bit of this. And up against this building, I want this to get a little darker. And then we'll get really dark, mixing up ultramarine and burnt orange, and start coming in around this. Then I'll take a round and I'll soften that. And then go back to my flat after I rinse all the color off of it, and just start dragging this down vertically. And I want to add plenty of water in here. Get a nice wet look in here. There we go. We'll get a little bit of dark behind her. And you notice where the openings are in the windows. I'm purposely creating a reflection that reflects that dark shape as we go vertically, leaving some lighter areas in our reflection. To soften that, I'll just take a squirt bottle and just give it a quick squirt. And I might take a rigger, get some water on it. See what happens if we drop a little bit of droplets of water in there. It may or may not work. We might have to wait a little bit for it to dry. And I'll put in some some darker, warmer areas beneath some of these people. Clean my brush. We'll leave some little bits of dry white in there. And in a moment, we'll paint our people in. But right now, I just want to let this kind of settle down. Get a little lighter right in here. And we'll come in and put some dry brush marks on there for that little drainage gutter that runs down the middle of the lane. And I think if we take the elevation or the tape or anything that's elevating your board out and lay it flat, this will be a good time to just lay this flat and let it dry so it doesn't keep moving. When I say keep moving, the pigment, if your board is elevated, will continue to move downhill. So if you like what's happening right the way you've got it, I've got little bursts of warmth and bursts of cool in here. I want that to be my underpainting. So we'll let that dry just as it sits, flat, so it doesn't keep moving. Okay, once this is fairly dry, it's time to kind of go back now and do some evaluation. See where we stand with our building in the background. I think it needs to have just a little bit of definition in some of these places. So I'm going to put a few little marks in here that help define a few of the darks that are recesses in the building. But then I soften them with a damp brush so that they're not just random marks on the paper. They actually kind of tell us that there's some recesses in this facade. There's openings, there's shadows, there's all kinds of things happening, which we may or may not see all the detail to. So come back in. Some of these little freeze marks get defined a little bit more. Let's go ahead and put our people in, and then we can come back in and finish the street and put in any of the little steps and base cornices that go along the sidewalk. So most of these people are in silhouette. They're fairly dark. So we're going to work with some cooler colors. I'll mix up some of my the warm colors that I had in my mixing area with some cool colors and just get sort of a mixture of kind of a slate color. And we'll just put a few of these people in here behind some of the ones that are in the foreground. These are just little shapes back here. They don't have to be perfect. I'm going to add a little bit of water to my brush and wipe it off, and then just soften the bottoms of some of these dark marks. Then I might come back in here now and put in maybe some warmer colors. I've got some burnt orange. We'll add a little bit of that in there. Maybe there's a couple people back there that are a little bit warm. Clean our brush, touch those shapes for people, and just kind of let them kind of run a little bit. And then I've got one person in this painting, or in this photo reference, that's in a really nice teal raincoat. So we'll top that off with a little touch of teal, take a clean brush and just drag that across the bottom of that deposit of teal. I would like to put a little bit of red in here. I think red is a nice color. And so we'll just take this guy over here. He's got a jacket on that's red. And again, I'm going to rinse my brush and just soften the bottom of that really strong red with just by letting it go a little lighter in value, just by taking a damp brush and softening the bottom edge of that. Our foreground person, Peggy, has a teal Hawaiian shirt on. So we're gonna kind of play up that color that she's got. And we'll just take a clean brush, lighten it, and soften the bottom of that. And then it's a little cooler over on this shoulder, and it stands out against that umbrella. So it has to be a little darker value. And I'm going to come in under her arm with a little cooler color on this side. And that's just cobalt that's mixed in with the teal to give it that look. And then she's got, we'll put a camera strap or something across there in a moment, but she's got a hat on. And I want to allow you to see that hat. The photo doesn't really show it, but I'm going to do a kind of a little bit of a lighter value. We'll use like a yellow ochre and then leave a little bit of white in there. So it's a lighter value. And we'll come back in and capture her face in a moment, which is behind her hands. She's holding the camera up to her face. But let's get the pant legs on there. We'll get a little bit of a greenish khaki. And some of that's going to run right up into her shirt. And then I want to get a little warmer color over on this side. And then get a really dark, cool color kind of back in here. That look darker in there behind her elbow. That works. I'll wipe some of this water off. All right, now we've got some other people with cooler jackets that are more of a blue in here. Go to cobalt. That changes up a little bit. And then the legs will be darker. Couple people back there. And then I'm just going to clean my brush and kind of soften some of these legs so that they become reflections coming towards us. Straight down. We need to get some with Peggy here. We'll get a little darker over here in the corner still. But that really nice warmth along there kind of finishes this off. And then we want to get the same bit of warmth coming towards us here. A little bit of blue in there. Windows are going to be pretty dark. We'll get, did I bump us? Here we go. Sorry about that. elevate my board again so I can put a little squirt on here, let the water do the work for me. It'll soften those columns. It'll drag all that warmth down into the lane. Pick up some of the excess water that's running down. And I want to cool that off a bit, so I'll add some cobalt. All right. We'll let that dry. Definitely want to soften this one line right here. And put in a little bit of warmth back in our lane where the alleyway is, or the drain. Leaving little bits of white here and there to suggest the texture of the road. Now, once this is dry, I'll do some of that over there as well. Add a little bit more cobalt blue in here. I might even just kind of flick it on there, because it's so wet that it'll start running down and mixing with these other colors and cool off some of that warmth in there. I've said this before in other classes and lessons. Warm precedes, warm comes forward, dark comes forward. Anything that's dark and warm makes it feel closer to the viewer. So thus I say warm precedes. Cool and light recede. So if you want your cathedral to be light, you want your sky to be far distant, keep it very light in value, and it will recede away from us. Even in this facade here that's in shadow, this one roof or gable here on this facade is a cooler neutralized blue. It's got some cobalt mixed with raw umber, but it pushes back, whereas some of these stronger colors here in the foreground feel very warm and dark. They come forward. So we're starting to feel and see the projection of space and distance. So as this starts to dry, I'll come back in and finish some of the detailing for the person. And what we'll do is we'll start off with a little bit of pyro red. Get a nice warm red. We'll get some yellow ochre and a little bit of cobalt and maybe a little bit of yellow. See how that looks. Needs a little bit more yellow ochre. There we go. This will be down. Now it's too light, too dark. We want to get a little bit lighter. So I'm gonna bring just a, oops, guess what? Her shirt is still very, very wet. We'll wait on that. Too soon to jump in on her arm. But I'll get that very soon. I'm going to take a clean brush and use the color that's in her umbrella to just drag across the white negative shape that's there on the back, on the bottom side and the back side. So it just tints it slightly. We still see it as a negative shape, but it just tinted. And I'm going to come back in with some of this warmer orange color. A little bit of raw sienna, thank you. And mix up just some face colors for some of our people in there. I think the orange works a little better, tends to warm up their faces. And I'm just adding the tops of their heads a little. That's all. We don't really need to worry too much about detail. These people are so far back up the street that all we need to see is just a little bit. And I'll come back in and I'm going to darken some of their shoulders as we go across this middle mass of people, just so we see some connectivity going across there. Just dark shapes. There we go. I'm going to dry this. I think while this is still pretty wet, it's very shiny, which means the water is still sitting up on the surface. I'm just starting to lose the sheen. Take my rigger to get some fresh water, and I'm going to sprinkle a little bit in the foreground here on these cobblestone pavers to get it to repel some of that dark pigment, so that we get the reflections on the tops of these cobblestones, and you get that kind of mottled look that we kind of appreciate. And then might be able to take a clean brush, wipe it all off, get all the paint off of it, get most of the moisture off this brush, squeeze out the pigments, and I can probably come in here with a little bit of lift to get a few highlights going across here. Maybe even take a tissue and do that. And then as I come back with some of the orange, and I'm going to get a variety of just colors in here for the street. And we'll get some of these coming up the side of the drain line, and we'll just kind of soften that. Come in with some darks. Take a little squirt and see if we can get this loosened up a little. Once this dries, I'll put a little tone in that negative shape of the drain, so it isn't quite so white, but it'll still give us a nice pathway into up the alley. Takes us to our destination, which is the cathedral in the background. This is still very wet. We painted this painting pretty much almost exclusively wet, going in and out of a few spots where it gets dry. But it gives some interesting soft atmospheric effects. I'd like to maybe get a little darker definition up in some of these rooftops. We can get that in there. Get a few little details coming across that give it some character. And then there we go. Just now that it's starting to dry a little bit, I'm going to come back in and just give us a few suggestions of darks within these little openings. A little bit of raw sienna. See if we can't get Just take a brush and just soften that. And then what else we need? We need to finish our little lamp posts or our lanterns. So we'll get some darks back in and just put a few little shapes back in there that suggest that's about it. Maybe that. And get her elbows and forearms, and we should be about done. So we'll try a little bit of quinacridone rose and some gamboge. See if that'll work. And a little bit of yellow ochre. If you can't get the right color, start over. Don't keep going at it, because then I'm going to add just a little bit of pyro red to this. There we go. We'll get her elbow a little bit red. Clean our brush and just take a damp brush and come up the side of her arm. Capture a little bit of her face in there with that same pigment. Maybe a little bit of orange underneath the hat. And then once that dries, we'll put a black camera in her hand, so we can see the definition of her hand. And I'm going to put a little stronger. There we go. There. I think we're about done. Put some of this blue in there. I think that may be all we need. Take a little bit of ultramarine and get that darkened over on this side. Camera in there somewhere. And then we'll have a little bit of a strap for her couple just indications of cobblestones here and there. And then we'll take a rigger, as long as this is dry up here, and we'll put some all the little electrical lines and things that are going across. I'm gonna get something that's got some warmth to it. So we'll use a little bit of burnt orange and some ultramarine. And I came down here with a little bit Coming across here. Get some coming across. A little bit more water on there. Just putting some dry brush in here with a few darks, just to punch things up in a couple of spots. All right, I think that's looking pretty good. I think we're about there. So I'm going to make sure this is dry before we put any final touches on here. Let me get something to separate this. Why did I do that? Just to bring it forward towards us. Now I'm going to use a little bit of white wash, and we'll put a couple of little trim pieces on here, the rigger. I don't ever use the white wash in my palette. I keep it in a separate little container that keeps it from contaminating my transparent medium. But I'll put this on here, maybe put a couple of little details on here that suggest signage. Maybe there's a couple of little things in here. But more importantly, I've got some nice dark areas here that I can maybe splatter with some sparkle from the reflections of the water. See if we, no, that's not gonna work. I'm gonna get a springier rigger, more water. And those are sort of like some of the little reflections on the stones, the tops of the rounded cobblestone. And then I can pick this up and just kind of got to get more water and more paint in there. Go. I think we'll call that a day. Any questions? You want me to recap anything?
Thank you, Randy. Does anybody have any questions or want any clarification? Well done. Fantastic.
Kind of a fun little cityscape. It's so full of detail when you walk through these cities. You know, all the architecture is very overwhelming. it's all about simplifying and just getting a combination of cools and warms to run together. It unifies this whole facade. Rather than painting individual buildings, you paint one big wash. I think it may have surprised or overwhelmed some of you when I started painting this whole facade, but it has to be one unified facade to make it feel like it's containing this lane. If we tried to paint a little bit of, one building and then the next building and then the next building, each one of these washes would have dried and we wouldn't have gotten a consistent gradation going back to our center of interest back here at the back. It would have been chopped up. All we did is put a little bit of indication of windows in there, some perspective lines for the horizontal trim boards on these buildings, a little bit of awning in here just to give, all of these things are pushing and pointing towards a center, which is a 1 point perspective that takes us to our center of interest. We can even take, just thought of this, we can take a little bit of that white and maybe even put a little bit of an umbrella in here. Just a few indications in there. Doesn't take much. I'm going to put a little color of white on her hat, just so we see that there's a hat there. Doesn't have to be much. And a little bit of light next to the warmth of her elbows, just to define that hand. There. All right. I think that's it. I'm not going to do any more. Step away from the painting and say,
Stand
you know?
back, stand away.
Yeah. So I'll be anxious to see what everybody comes up with. We've got a big crowd of people here in the background that are kind of bringing up the tail end of the tour. So I'm going to put a few little, maybe a couple of little white sparkly things on here where they might be having sheen or wet or reflections on their shoulders. Doesn't take much, but it just gives us a crowd of people there that populates the painting and says there's something coming down the road towards the viewers, and makes it kind of fun. So you can kind of see what we've got. But keep it, just give suggestions. You don't have to define every window. You don't have to define every mullion, every little detail. It's all about the mood and the atmosphere that a rainy day suggests, and gives us all this wet and wet type work with just a few little, details here and there that kind of give it a crisp accents. But the overall painting is very soft, and it's done with values, going from a dark value to a light value, a warm value to a cool value. It's not about all the detailing. So you can see this whole side of the facade is a pretty loose, warm side with a few little indications on there. Over on this side, it's all pretty cool and in shadow, but it's equally, soft. Just suggestions of windows, because we're looking at it so obliquely that you don't really see all the detail. You just see the lineup of the window openings without any real definition. And it just kind of helps the viewer funnel their attention down the lane to the portico of the cathedral at the square that this lane empties into. So it makes it for a lot of fun. And it helps us understand how to approach some of these moody days that, might not be the best day to be out painting, but they create wonderful opportunities to create atmosphere with watercolor.